Welcome to the University of North Texas Christian Network. We are an employee resource group, and today we're going to be talking about the intersections of identity between race, academia, and Christianity. We got to this point from having a series of book clubs. We started with finding common ground, we grew into every good endeavor, and we tried to figure out how we could connect our work to God's word. Just before COVID, we had started with the Bible study related to Ephesians, and we were drawn to the conflict that emerged in chapter 6 between the idea of race and gender as espoused by Paul. This led us to seek further information, and we decided to have this particular talk where we invited George Yancey, who's a professor of sociology at Baylor University. He is a former faculty at UNT, and he has a PhD and MA from UT Austin. He has published a number of books. He's got books on race, and then he's also got books about Christians in academia and approaches to transcending racial barriers. Dean Tamara Brown is the Executive Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences at UNT. She has a PhD and MA in clinical psychology at University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and a Master's of Divinity from Asbury Theological.
Hello, everyone. And yes, I was part of the Mean Green family for almost 19 years. So some of y'all may know me, some of you may not. I just wanted, I'm really glad for this opportunity to talk about my identity as an African American, my identity as a Christian, and how they both impact my work. I'm talking about the thing I know the most, I'm the most expert in, which is my own life, I guess. And so it's, and I hope that it's useful to some degree. I've obviously been an African American my whole life. I've been a Christian since I was 19. I was saved through the work of a ministry that was very powerful in my life. What I'd like to talk about, though, is how those sort of merge together as far as impacting me and my work. And to understand that, I have to go into understanding, my journey as an African American, because for a good chunk of my early part of my life as an African American, I probably wasn't. I didn't have a very strong Black identity. I encountered racism and things of that nature, and I encountered some bigotry and stuff like that. And I tend to write that off as, just a few racist people who are out there, but by and large, nothing can stop me from doing what I want to do because this is America. Well, when I was in grad school, for the first time in my life, I fell in love. And yes, I was late to the game as far as falling in love. Most people had done it before then, but it took me to grad school. And she was white. And I fell in love with her, and I think she fell in love with me. And I wanted to meet her mother. Her mother and father had been separated. I wanted to meet her mother. And her mother would not meet me. And her mother would not meet me because I was African American. And I thought, well, once she got to know me, of course, she's going to think this is a great guy. What a great catch. I mean, my daughter's got this guy's going to become a college professor and successful. No, I was Black. That was that. And that was a very important point in my life as far as my racial identity. Whereas I became a Christian at 19, in some ways, I began to fully realize my Blackness at that point, which I think I was like 27, 28 when that all occurred. And it began to shape how I began to do my work. I was in grad school at the time in the sociology field, and it began to shape my research. I'd already begun my dissertation, so it didn't affect my dissertation per se, but it began to shape my research from that point on. I began to get an interest in studying interracial families, thank you, for obvious reasons. I had, I had interracial relationship that had gone bad, that had gone awful. I want to understand interracial families because I want to understand this sort of resistance to them. And so my first few articles after my dissertation, my article for my dissertation, dealt with interracial dating, interracial families, things of this nature. Being a Christian also played a role in that. To sort of complicate that, when I was going through the situation with this young lady, I didn't always find my Christian friends to be very supportive. And because of that, I was wondering, why is that on something that seemed to be silly to me as to be a problematic? And in today's society, I think we do see it as silly. But back then, people did not see it as silly. It was a very real barrier. So that got me interested in how Christians think about racial issues. And eventually, as I was doing research on interracial families, I also began to develop an interest in doing research on multiracial churches. And indeed, I was going for a grant on multiracial churches. I wanted to do a pilot study on a single multiracial church. I didn't get that grant, but what happened was I was contacted while I was applying for that grant by someone else who had seen some of my research and knew I was a Christian and was interested in whether I worked for him on a larger grant with a multiracial church. So I think God just sort of came into this. And his grant was much larger, and it got me my research moving from interracial families to looking more at multiracial communities, multiracial religious communities. And from that, I began to work on this research and developed books along those ways. 2003, I believe. I know this is dating me, so yeah, I'm older than I look, hopefully. 2003 became a book called United by Faith, based on that research. And I also began to work on a Christian book that dealt with how to become a more multiracial church. And I think that book came out in 2004, if I remember correctly. And it was called One Body, One Spirit. I may be off on that. So I dived really studying into racial issues, and studying multiracial families and studying interracial congregations made me think about this whole issue of race and ethnicity. How do we solve this problem? How do we move past this problem? And I began to see multiracial families and interracial congregations as venues in which you can study where people of different races had to learn how to get along with each other. If you're in a multiracial family, you gotta learn how to get along with people of different races. Multiracial churches are voluntary organizations. It's not like being at a workplace or a school where you have to come in order to get paid or get your education. You choose to go to a certain church. How do people in multiracial churches begin to deal with the issues that are there? How do we negotiate these racial issues in our lives? And I began to think along these lines as I studied these venues. And I think that being a Christian also helped me to see things in a different light. Now, much of the stuff that I wrote about and did was not that different from what anyone else would do, be they Christian, Black, on these sort of issues. But I was always trying to think, what's happening here? And one of the things that I came to the conclusion was that in these venues, when you're in a family situation or a religious situation, voluntary organization situation, you have to learn how to communicate with one another. You do not have the luxury of engaging in stereotyping. Obviously it happens, but not to the same degree. You can't other people. You can't see them as the other if you're in your family, in your congregation. You have to communicate with them. And I began to think about a theory of communication as a possible pathway away from the racial alienation that was so strong in our society. And so I worked with a colleague of mine named Michael Emerson. And in 2010, we came out with a book called Transcending Racial Barriers. And we sort of outlined our thinking along these lines. Now, it was published by Oxford University Press. So we relied on some of our research in these areas, sociological theories, to make the argument that communication done in a productive manner can help to create productive solutions in our society. And our failure to do that and our tendency to latch onto solutions that serve our group holds us apart. I had a few years earlier written a Christian version of this argument, 2006, in a book called Transcending Racial Barriers. In that book, it was published by University Press. So part of my career is I've published Christian books and I've published academic books. The Christian book, the Christian version of that, I did not rely as much on sociological theories. I made an argument based on scripture, based on my theological understandings of the situation. That was sort of the direction I went with that. So those sort of two books kind of helped to shape how I saw the path we should go on racial issues. Now, an interesting thing happened when those two books came out. And what happened was, in a sense, I felt that, okay, I've said what I have to say on racial issues. I've said it to a Christian audience. I've said it to an academic audience. I've laid out a direction that I think would be very productive. And I didn't want to write the same type of book and do the same type of research again and again and again. By this point in time, I've been working on issues of race ethnicity for about a decade. And I thought, well, I gave myself permission to stop working on issues on race ethnicity. I thought that this was what I had done. I had said what I had to say, and it was time to move on from that. And I was interested in other topics. And so I was excited about studying something other than race and ethnicity. And I know some of y'all are professors and you may be able to relate to this, that sometimes you get tired of studying the same thing over and over again. And I'd sort of reached that point. And so there's other things I was interested in. And here my Christian identity kind of comes into play a little bit more, because I experienced outside of academia what it's like to be an African American in the United States. And I experienced, as I told you that initial story, that there are things being Black, where if you're Black, you cannot overcome. I could not overcome the objections of my ex-girlfriend's mother, who would not even meet with me. So I experienced that. But inside academia, it was a different story. Being a Christian was where the issue was at. And just to relate a story, I remember teaching, this was before I got my doctorate and I was an adjunct, and they were assigning courses. And I remember one semester I was assigned two intro sociology courses, a race ethnicity sociology course, and a sociology religion course. And I found out later that there was discussion on whether or not I should be assigned the sociology religion course, because it was well known that I was a Christian. And the argument was, well, he's a Christian. Can he be unbiased in a sociology of religion course? Which I found a very interesting concern, since I was also teaching race ethnicity. I am an African American. Can I be unbiased teaching that race ethnicity course? So I use this just to illustrate that I was seeing some of the anti-Christian bias in academia. And now that I was no longer doing race ethnicity, I felt free to want to study that. And so I did a project that led to a book that came out in 2010 called Compromise in Scholarship. And in that project, I studied political and religious bias. And I actually thought, going into the project, even though I felt there would be religious bias, I thought there'd be more political bias. And my reasoning was quite simple. I knew that there were Christian sociologists. I was in an organization of Christian sociologists. At that point in time in my life, I didn't know a single sociologist who was a Republican. So I thought, well, I know if obviously there was no organization that was a organization for Republican sociologists. So I thought, well, there's going to be religious bias, but the bias really is going to be political. Well, as they say, I was wrong. When I did the study, there was political bias, but the stronger bias was against religious others, especially evangelicals, fundamentalists, Mormons. Those groups were the ones who faced the stronger bias, which was even more eye-opening to me than I anticipated. I knew there was religious bias, but I always thought the political bias was driven by political animosity, whereas it might be the other way around. This led me to wanting to study this component of anti-Christian bias more completely. And so I engaged in some other research projects. And this led to, and of course, I'm writing research articles along the way with this. I'm telling you about the books because I think those are really good markers of where I'm at. But in 2014, I wrote a book called, with a colleague, wrote a book called So Many Christians, So Few Lions. We got that title because we actually, in the midst of our studies, began to run into T-shirts and bumper stickers and even maybe onesies that says "So many Christians, so few lions," of course, referring to the Roman Colosseum, and sort of like supposed to be a ha-ha joke. So we thought that would be a good title for our book. In 2017, I came out with a book where I argued that what's known as right-wing authoritarianism was poorly defined, and that you could do the same thing only looking at anti-Christian bias and get the similar results. And I showed this in the book's called Dehumanizing Christians. So I began to jump into studying sort of anti-Christian animosity, which led to other interesting directions, because as I studied that, I began to find certain subcultures to be very interesting, subcultures that I normally would not hang out with, but because I was studying anti-Christian animosity, I learned more about them. For example, I began to study cultural progressive individuals, people who are activists and cultural progressives. That led to a book in 2012, and that book is, and it's in my mind right now. Anyways, a book in 2012. You can just put my name in 2012 and find the book. And they also studied atheists, and that came out to a 2013 book, There Is No God, that came out. What Motivates Cultural Progressives? That's the name of the book. It just came to me. So, anyways, that led me to studying these other interesting groups that I was finding fascinating, and it was kind of fun studying people who thought differently than I did, and learning what makes them tick. I also, this direction led me also to studying Christians of a different variety. I was saved through a ministry. It was an evangelical ministry. I have gone to evangelical churches ever since I was saved. I grew up, I went to different types of churches. I went to some mainline denominational churches. I went to some Black Protestant churches. I think for a short period of time went to some Catholic churches. But from 19 on, I was in mostly conservative Protestant churches. So it was fascinating then to study different types of Christians now with this new lens, because one thing I discovered in one of my articles was that among progressive Christians, or mainline Christians, I believe, is our measure we're using, mainline Christians, that there was more acceptance of non-Christians than conservative Protestant Christians. Well, that really got me interested. I thought that was very fascinating. And so I began to study the differences between conservative Christians and progressive Christians. And that research is going to culminate in a book that's coming out in a few months, in July, I believe. And the name of that book is When Faith No Longer. And basically, I and my co-author argue that if you look at Christianity, in the United States at least, it's a mistake to think of it as one large coherent faith that progressive Christians and conservative Christians, the way they understand meaning is so different that we think they should actually be two different religions. So that book's going to come out. Now, when that book comes out, I'm probably done with that phase of studying progressive Christians. And the reason why, and this just shows how everything just comes around. You know, I started first part of my career, a lot of it is about race. This part has been a lot about religion. In some ways, I'm circling back around to race with some religion mixed back in. And to explain this, I have to go back to last year. So last year, I was still planning on finishing up my studies of progressive Christians and conservative Christians. And honestly, I was thinking of either moving on and studying faith-based efforts towards homelessness, and I still may do that. I was also thinking about studying what I would consider the elite of our society, the cultural elite, because I think that so much of what happens in our society is done because of a certain cultural elite that people don't really study, they don't really look at very, very seriously. Well, of course, last year we had the deaths of George Floyd and I forgot to say his name, the man who was jogging, and Aubrey, yes. And that was something that, now, let's be honest, this is not the first time an African-American man was killed in the hands of police or in the hands of in Aubrey's case, you know, a couple of racists. But something about those two things happening so close together, and the fact that someone was killed just jogging, and I go out biking all the time, just sort of disturbed me for a little while. And so I sort of pulled back from everything for a period of time, just so I could reflect and think. And when I decided to re-engage, to start following the news again, to get back on social media again, something had changed. There was much more interest. The book that I wrote in 2006, there was a lot more attention. A book that I wrote 15 years ago, and people were contacting me and asking me about that. And there was a discussion, and I began to see some of the dynamics of race happen in our society. And one of my conclusions was that what I advocated for 10 years ago, was not happening. We were not having productive conversations. And after some time of prayer and some time of, I'll admit it, resistance, because I wasn't really eager to jump back into discussing racial issues again, I've come to the conclusion that that's exactly what I need to do. And so I'm entering into a new phase of my research, where I am going to study the potential of what I call collaborative communications on dealing with racial alienation. At the very beginning part of doing the research, I do have a project where I'm collecting data right now, and that should end in about a month, and I can start writing that up. Collecting data on a longer term project right now, and trying to get grants right now. So I'm jumping into that with both feet, even as I close off some of the other projects that I'm doing. And that's going to be the next phase. I will say that even though it seems like I've gone from race to religion to race back again, I actually feel that this last part is, this last part, I'm merging them together because I think that part of my ideas on how to address race comes from my religious beliefs, comes from how I see theologically, comes from my understanding of human depravity, that it's not an accident that I come to conclusions that a lot of other race scholars have not come to. And so even though I'm going to start doing more work on race more explicitly, I don't think that I'm dropping the religious component. It's just taking a different shape. So as I think that my presentation shows, my identity as an African-American and as a Christian constantly has shaped how I've studied, how I've approached my research, and sort of issues that are important to me. Just a little side note, I also think that those things affect other aspects of my job, such as my teaching. I do know that research is out there for whatever reason that teachers of color tend to encourage more communication in their classrooms, group discussion in classrooms than white teachers. I'm not sure why that is, but I know that that's something that I try to encourage in my classroom. And I also know that having some ideological minority status as an academic, being a conservative Christian, at least religiously I do, makes me more humble to some degree in the way I present myself. Obviously, as a professor, the freshman coming in your class is not going to know as much on your subject as you do. I mean, so it's not, I'm not one of these that, I'm not going to pretend that I'm going to learn as much in this as my students are going to, because to me, I don't think that's realistic. But I do try to bring a humbleness into it. And I have learned from my students at different times throughout my years of teaching. And so I do think that even though I've not thought as deeply, I think being an African-American Christian impacts the way I teach. It clearly shapes the way I do research, the research questions I do. It doesn't shape my methods per se. My methods are the same as other sociologists by and large, but it does shape the sort of questions I want to tackle. Helps me to see things I would not normally have seen. And for that, I'm very grateful, because I wouldn't want to be one of those boring people who say the same things everyone else does. And so with that, I'll go ahead. I think that's about, it's almost half an hour out.
Go ahead.
All right, good afternoon. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you today on this important topic. Because we're talking about identities, I want to start by sharing mine as a foundation for the comments that I will make today. I am an African-American woman. I'm a Christian. I grew up missionary Baptist, but have been United Methodist for a very long time. I grew up in the church and was baptized at age 7. So my faith has been a long-standing aspect of my identity, although it has grown, evolved, and changed considerably over the course of my life. I'm a professor of psychology, and my academic discipline is clinical psychology. And I'm a university administrator. I am the executive dean for the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences. And I've been asked to share with you how these identities intersect for me. These identities are always with me. They always intersect. And internally, they are an ever-present influence. But externally, I have some degree of choice in the identities that I reveal. And context plays an important role in those choices. It's also the case that these identities manifest differently depending on the context, and that one identity may be more salient externally in one context as compared to another. So for example, I can choose to hide the fact that I am an academic. I could choose to hide the fact that I'm a Christian. But being an African-American woman is not an aspect of my identity that I can ever hide. When people first encounter me, that's the aspect of my identity that's immediately visible. These other aspects may or may not, depending on the context, be as immediately visible to people. I'm also aware that depending on the context, people download their pre-existing stereotypes and prejudices that they have about African Americans in general and assume that those viewpoints apply to me. For example, in the classroom, when I have taught at predominantly or historically white institutions, the presumption has been that because I'm African American, I'm not as competent as my white peers. And one of the ways that this comes out in students' behavior is in how they address me. When my white colleagues enter the classroom students immediately address them as Dr. So-and-so. Whether they have the doctorate or not, that's the automatic assumption because they come and they stand in front of the classroom. When I enter the classroom, however, that's not the automatic assumption for me. And so they address me as Mrs. Brown. The automatic assumption rarely is that because I'm standing in front of the classroom also, I must be a doctor. I also remember when I was teaching a college class of about 200 students at a predominantly white institution, one of those students told me at the end of the semester that I was the first African-American teacher that he had ever had in all of his K through 12 and college education. And so he didn't know what to expect. An interesting statement when I stand in front of the classroom. And then he went on to say he was surprised that he actually enjoyed the class and got a lot out of it. So again, in certain settings, I know that when people see that I'm African-American or an African-American woman, there are ideas that automatically get downloaded. There are stereotypes, there are prejudices, and that governs how they see me, the assumptions they make about me, and how they interact with me, the expectations they have. So I've learned that in academic settings, I must share my academic credentials very early in conversation so that I can help manage the impressions that people have of me and answer their unspoken questions of whether I belong and where I belong. But that's just not the case in other settings. In other contexts, be it the civic organizations in which I engage and am a member, or in a local church, people might never know my academic credentials, for example. So just an illustration of how context shapes how I show up and what I reveal about those other aspects of my identity. One example of how I've made intersectionality of race, faith, and academia externally visible to people is by integrating faith into my research. When I studied the predictors and correlates of substance use for African American adolescents, I examined spirituality as a variable. And in one study, I investigated whether the inconsistency between religious beliefs and religious behaviors predicted substance use for college students. So in other words, I wanted to know if you say you're very religious, but you don't go to church, for example, or engage in practices that are consistent with whatever that religion is that you say you're very religious, whatever you mean when you say that. If you say you're very religious, but you don't go to church, let's say, does that inconsistency create problems that lead to substance use for college students? It's a question I investigated. I've also investigated the role of religiosity versus spirituality in the mental well-being of African Americans. I've done research on how to disentangle religiosity from spirituality at the measurement level for African Americans and others. And I've been involved in a research project that investigated how prayer really works. I even started a spirituality research group in a department where nearly all of the faculty and all of the students were atheists. The research group was attended by one other faculty member in that department and several of the graduate students. And we presented at conferences in our discipline and published several papers together. So these are just some examples of ways that my race, my faith, and my academic pursuits have aligned. I should say that this is possible for me in part because in the United Methodist Church, there is an expectation that you use your mind as an expression of faith. So doing these research and pursuing these research topics was easy for me to contemplate. And for me, it's a way that I loved God with my mind. But doing this research would have been harder and perhaps even impossible if I belonged to a faith community that viewed asking questions as sacrilege or as antithetical to faith. Again, context matters. My commitment to social justice and to diversity, equity, and inclusion are also informed by my faith. In terms of social justice, consider the Old Testament's teachings about gleaning. Israelite law required that the corners of fields not be harvested, and that whatever fell to the ground during the first round of harvesting should not be picked up. And the purpose of that law was to feed the poor, orphans, widows, and strangers. This teaching in the Old Testament makes it clear that God's desire is for people of means to create opportunities for the poor and the marginalized. In terms of diversity, equity, inclusion, Jesus practiced and modeled radical inclusion. In the New Testament, a story is told of a conversation that Jesus had with an expert in the law. That expert asked him, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And since the man was an expert in the law, Jesus asked him, "Well, what's written in the law?" And the man answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." Jesus said, "You've answered correctly. Do this and you will live." And then the man said, "Well, who's my neighbor?" And Jesus responded with a story. He said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, he passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, he came to where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring oil and wine, and then he put him on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day, he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Look after him. And when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense that you might have.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." And Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." So Jesus never suggested that his followers should fear strangers, hate them, or reject them, even if those strangers practiced a different religion, or even if they were perceived as enemies. Instead, he very pointedly told his followers to welcome them, to love them, and to care for them. In fact, Jesus spoke to people of all cultural and religious backgrounds, regardless of what others thought about it. Consider the Samaritan woman at the well who asked Jesus, "How can you, a Jew, ask me, a Samaritan woman, for a drink? For Jews do not associate with Samaritans." Despite the cultural divisions of his day and whatever others may have said, Jesus did not hesitate to bridge this divide and many others through his love and patience. He also spoke in parables so that everyone could understand, which is yet another form of inclusion. So in my academic role, whenever I advocate for social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion, I'm behaving in ways that are consistent with and actually informed by my identity as a Christian. I also believe that I am to share my faith with others that I encounter. And I do that in a variety of ways, even within academia. And all of those ways have to do not with proselytizing, but with me just sharing about my relationship with the triune God. And sometimes I share without ever saying a word. For example, people see my faith in the small things I do or the images that I display. When I go on business meals, like dinner with a job candidate, I pause and pray over my food before I eat. That's customary for me, and I don't refrain from it because I'm at a business function. But I don't do it in a boisterous way that draws attention to me or that requires everybody else to stop their conversation or whatever they're doing while I pray. When I experience success or someone gives me a compliment, I sometimes respond by giving credit to God externally. I don't go on and on about it because, again, I'm not trying to proselytize, but I do acknowledge that whatever good or great thing I've accomplished hasn't been through my efforts alone. And when people observe that I'm able to keep my wits about me, even when those around me are losing theirs, and they ask me why, then I'm honest in my response about how I'm able to do it. When a colleague shared with me earlier this year that Bertina had died, I asked that colleague, what can I do for the family? The person said, there's nothing that can be done at this time. And my immediate response was, I know something that I can do. I can pray, and I commit to do it. It's not uncommon for me to share what my faith tradition teaches me about a particular moment and how I'm trying to put that teaching into practice, but I am equally quick to acknowledge other faith traditions. And I encourage people to adhere to their own faith traditions in the very best way they know how, because that's what I'm doing. Let me conclude by saying this. I believe God encounters all of us in our particular beliefs or circumstances or situation, and God speaks to us in the language that we can understand in that moment. We may hear and experience it in different ways, but the message is always the same. God's unwavering and unconditional love for all people. God's demonstration of love toward us is so consistent, and at times it's even overwhelming. And so should it be with us, that God's great love is demonstrated through our words and deeds, even in the way we show up in academia and engage in our work and engage with our colleagues. As I said, my faith is the foundation of everything. But that's not to say that I'm perfect. Believe me, I'm not. I sin. I fall short of the mark. There are things I shouldn't say and do, but I say them and I do them. And I leave unsaid and undone things that I should have said and done. But what I am saying is that my faith is like a North Star for me. It guides me. When I lose my way, it helps me find my way back. It's why I don't give up and throw in the towel when I experience or observe racism or sexism or injustice of varying sorts within academia. It's the hidden resource that I draw on to sustain me. It's my faith that enables me to have hope despite the hopelessness and uncertainty that I see all around me. And it's my faith that enables me to keep pressing toward the mark. Again, thank you for the opportunity to share briefly with you today.
Wow, thank you so much, both Dr. Yancey and Brown. We have a few questions that have come in, and I invite the audience to ask more. My thought is that one of the easiest things that I could do was to share a screen with the question. Let me see if I can figure out how to make it cut out. Is there something I'm doing wrong?
You can say it.
Okay. So it's a pretty long question. So can you discuss, Dean Brown, about, you can read it, about.
Well, let me read it out loud then. I've been asked to discuss how the theological view of human depravity may influence my work and thinking, particularly juxtaposed against a more dominant view of cultural humanism. Do you see or experience any similarities or contradiction, and how might views of and value of race influence this, if at all? I'm not sure I understand the question, but let me take a stab, and please add more in the chat if I'm missing the essential element of what you're intending to convey, and have me and also George respond to. When I think of, when I see words like human depravity, I assume what is meant is the reality that we are all born into sin. We don't have to sin, but we do. And the question is, how does our failing in that regard, sin meaning falling short of the expectations that God has for how we live in this world, how does that reality influence my work and my thinking?
Yeah.
Is there more clarity?
Yeah, so it's from Robin Henson, and he said it's meant for both. It was prompted by George's mention of his views in his recent research endeavors.
Okay, good deal.
So
Let me start then with you about your research endeavors.
I actually thought the question was going towards you.
Mhm, yeah.
Since your name was there, I was going to interfere.
I know, I thought so
it
too.
came during her
Okay,
talk,
yeah,
so I
okay.
typed it at that
All
time.
right.
Okay,
Sorry.
Yeah, because this is what I thought about more. You know, when I was in grad school, I was taught about the Enlightenment movement and the move towards human perfectibility, and then that was a great driver towards the establishment of the social sciences. If you read, understand your Comp, Comp was science is becoming the new religion. We're going to reach its perfectibility, and that is a viewpoint. My viewpoint is that while humans have wonderful worth, I don't think that we are the type that is going to reach human perfectibility. And that's where depravity comes in. And the way to think about it for me, as far as race, is this way. Human perfectibility means that we're going to figure it out, and then we just have to teach people the right way to go, and then we'll solve racism. I don't think it works out quite that way because of depravity, because I have within me a selfishness, a confirmation bias that's going to help me to see certain things that I want as a solution to the detriment of others, that you can't rely on me to find the solution and teach everyone. We have to find a solution in communication with each other, because it's in that then you can inform me on things that I missed. I can inform you on things that we missed. And then we work together. Recognizing this sort of human depravity, and I know that I'm oversimplifying it because I'm not a theologian, but to me, the best evidence of human depravity is my kids. They were not born, with this sort of blank slate, perfect, and the world messed them up. They want. We have to be socialized to not do that, because that's our natural state, I believe. And so, because of that, I have to constantly work against that. And one way I can work against that and raise issues is to be in dialogue, not to shut people up, but not to center their opinion upon my own, nor mine above theirs, but can we work together? And maybe I can see some things that I can improve, you can see something you can improve, and we can work together. You may be more right than I am, I may be more right than you are. Let's have this sort of dialogue. And so that's how I see the way that this works out as concerns racial issues and dealing with that sort of thing. So that's sort of why I brought that in, and why it shapes how I approach racial issues, perhaps in a different way than a lot of other racial scholars.
you should continue.
I should, okay. All right. You are finding that the progressive Christian movement is standing on its separate religion.
Describe what is progressive Christians.
Yeah.
Very
Yeah, I know. I mean, I had to decide how much I was going to go into all these different books, as far as, so yeah, the way we operationalized it was on a theological basis. So we weren't talking about, did you vote Democrat or Republican, even though we know there's a correlation there. So we use a couple of measures. We use a measure of the Bible is the Word of God, and we use a measure of Jesus Christ the only way. And we just use that to divide into progressive and conservative Christianity. And so we didn't use denominations, we didn't use political, we use that. Now, when I say stay on separate religion and how the tenets separate, and this is just a very brief, and I hate to sound like I am using this to sell a book or two, but hey, you gotta get the book to get the full story. What we found is in quantitative work where we looked, studies, surveys, and in some qualitative work where we actually asked some questions about this, that conservative Christians describe their faith in a very different way than progressive Christians. And the clearest way I can say it is conservative Christians use their interpretation of the scriptures, and understand that interpretations vary, but their interpretations of scriptures, that's what they would use in order to root their morality. Progressive Christians tend to use notions of tolerance and inclusion to root it in, and to root in their notions of morality. Now, I'm not saying that neither one of them, that they didn't pay attention to the Bible, nor am I saying that conservative Christians don't care about being tolerant. But what I'm saying is that the way they describe how they found morality was very different. One of the things that we do in the book that to sort of illustrate this is because we know that people with conservative theology tend to be conservative politically, and people with progressive theology tend to be politically progressive. So we looked at two issues where conservative Christians might differ from Republicans. One where conservative Christians differ from Republicans generally, and one where progressive Christians tend to differ from progressives politically. And for the conservatives, it was immigration. They found a lot of conservative Christians who were saying, families, take care of them. They weren't open border, but they were, we found progressive Christians who were saying, look, we're disturbed by abortion. The difference that I found very interesting was that the conservative Christians, in arguing for their position, constantly went back to the scripture says thus, scripture says thus. Progressive Christians appealed, arguing against abortion, appealed to notions of social justice, just, I don't want to say tolerance, but inclusion of the unborn. And so in that sense, they're using their own moral values to make appeals against their political friends on most issues, but on these issues that they differed on. And so that's what, to me, along with some of the other evidence, but I think that's a way of showing that there's sort of a different moral framework that's being used to answer questions of meaning. And that's sort of where that came from. So Robin, do you have another question for me?
Well, I was thinking there was a question which Dean Brown was talking about.
This one's yours.
Really, I thought it hit home for me, which is the religious beliefs, people who shout out about I'm religious versus how they practice, people who don't go. So in a related point, Celeria raised the point, and so she's asked, what would you say is the difference between cultural Christianity and someone who actually practices the faith? For instance, KKK claims they are Christian.
Yeah, in that particular study that I was mentioning, just as a starting point in this direction, what we did was identify people who said, I consider myself to be very religious. And then we asked about how often they engaged in public religious behaviors, like going to church. But let me hasten to say, I'll finish that thought. What we found is that the greater the inconsistency, the higher the use of substances, But it depended on the behavior in question, so that was not uniformly the case. There are private religious behaviors as well, such as praying, reading scripture, consuming religious media. So there are a whole host of behaviors, and we didn't, of course, assess all of them, but we did find is that you get what you might expect about that discrepancy in some cases, but not in other cases. So it's a little bit more nuanced than that. Let me also say there's a difference between being religious and being spiritual. And we asked specifically about religiousness, which has to do with the tenets of a particular organized way of honoring one's deity. And that's not the only way to be faithful and to demonstrate that faith. So I'm being careful here to say religiousness and not spirituality, and those are not the same thing. So it's really about looking at a discrepancy between people who say religiousness, participating in an organized religion is critical for me. It's an important part of me. And then whether that participation is happening. But it is not to say that, that's the whole sum of it. There are those of us who adhere more strictly to tenets of a religion. This is not just about Christianity, it's about other religions as well, whether it's Judaism, whether it's being Muslim, and so forth. There's a range here. And so it is with Christians. And there's also good, God-fearing people who disagree as they struggle to understand the holy writings of their faith. One of the things that we know to be true in Christianity is that none of us knows the mind of God. We see through a glass darkly. We get some elements, but none of us have fully comprehended. And so I think there is a need for some humility there, and in that recognition that's important. When there are some things that seem abundantly clear, and if that is our understanding, then, as I said, we ought to hold true to that as best we can, and also remain open to the ongoing leading of the Holy Spirit, so that if we have strayed, if there is some aspect that we haven't accurately understood, we can be led to deeper understandings and a straighter walk on the path. But I would hesitate and be cautious about feeling like I know it all. I know exactly, sort of the mind of God and what God would say on these things. And anyone who disagrees with me just isn't reading it right or doesn't know the mind of God as closely as I do. I think we have to be a little humble in that and allow for some grace about those kinds of things, and pray for revelation in those opportunities. And then spend our time focused on those aspects that are crystal clear for us, just as Jesus did with that legal scholar. Right? What does the law say? We are to love God with everything that is within us. And we are a Master of Divinity degree, which is really about preparing myself for what I sensed God calling me to be and to do, was an act of faith. It is a calling that I remember struggling with at the time, but as I often do in my struggles, I try to get myself to just taking the next step. My desire and the way that I am formed is always to know all of the steps in the path before I get going. And God's answer to me, because God also knows how I was formed, is to only give just enough light for the step I'm on. And so pursuit of the MDiv degree was taking that next step, even though I didn't fully appreciate the depth of the calling on my life. It plays a role in just the ways that I was giving examples of before. I can't unknow what I know, and it influences my thoughts and shapes the ever evolving faith that I have. It's one of those things that has, as I said, changed and deepened my faith beyond my starting point, which I think is a good thing, right? We ought to be growing and maturing. In terms of, it's display in a secular university. I have only always been employed in secular universities. And so the examples that I gave reflect that. And in terms of the respect of the degree, I'm not sure, because I had a PhD at the time that I pursued an MDiv. So whatever, so that's a part of the context for me. In fact, I was pursuing this Master of Divinity degree while I was an assistant professor trying to get tenured, and pursuing that sort of research. So I already had the degree, I already had a job in academia in a secular university. I can tell you, it matters to people in ways that I don't always anticipate. So it's yet again a part of the importance of being as transparent as I can about my academic credentials, indeed all of them, to help people accurately appraise me. But when I introduce myself, sometimes I choose to mention that I have an MDiv, sometimes I don't, depends on the context. But people find out, and then it becomes a curiosity. Wow, this is not a part of an academic pedigree that I would expect for someone in your position, employed by this university or whatever. And so invariably it becomes a conversation opportunity, you know, and much the way that you're asking, tell me about that. And so it gives me a chance to share about my faith journey, and depending on the time, I'm being brief here out of service that we've gone over our time, but you know, depending on the time and the situation, I can go into more or fewer details about that faith journey, and about being called to ministry. I am an ordained clergy in the United Methodist Church as well, and so you know that becomes a part of what I can share, and sometimes that plants seeds for future opportunities for conversation. So it has, for me, it's not about the prestige of the credential. I can't really speak to that, but I can say it has opened doors of conversations to share about my faith that might otherwise not have been there, even in instances when I didn't divulge that I had the degree. It is just a curiosity for people in ways I didn't anticipate, but that I don't shy away from when I get asked questions about. So thank you for that question.
Thank you very much, both speakers, and to